Okay, so now we have our New York Times demo up and running, but I want to be able to use version control to help track changes and also share this with the larger world. So I want you guys to all be able to see the code that I wrote on a GitHub repository and refer to it later this week. Now, what's the first thing we start with? So we're in my project repository that I created, project directory, lect5nyt, and we want to make a local repository just locally on this machine. So I'm going to say on the terminal git init, and here it says initialized empty git repository, and then blah, blah, blah. So that's always going to be the first step. You're only going to do that once. Now let's see that this is actually working. We can type in git status, and basically what's going to show up is it's going to tell you a high-level overview of what's being tracked, what's not, and what's going on. So it says no commits yet on branch master, and then here are the two untracked files. We have our .env as well as our demo, our Python file that we made here. Now, to actually add a file to tracking, so right now this is just in our directory, but it's not in the staging area where it's going to be ready for an actual commit. To prepare it for that staging area and to add it there, you just do git add and then the name of the file. So you can do git add lecture5demo.py. And if I do git status now, we're going to see that one is green and one is red. So here, changes to be committed is my Python file. So it's ready to be committed. And then untracked, which hasn't been put in the staging area, is my .env. Now that's actually good. We don't want the .env to be there because we don't want to be able to push any of our API keys, like we said, to the internet. But there's a more systematic way, instead of picking and choosing what files we want, to make sure some files just never get added to Git and never can be added. For that, we use what's called a git ignore file. So we're going to create that file, touch.gitignore. And then we're going to open that file up. It's a hidden file because it starts with the dot. And here, we basically just have to list out all the files that we don't want Git to ever monitor. So this is kind of our blacklist. Now, the only one that we want in this case would be our .env file. So let's add that here. And whatever file name we put here should have the path relative to where our git ignore file is. So it's in the same directory. So I'm just going to put .env and that's it. Now let's make sure this works. I'm going to put git status in the terminal. And interestingly enough now, we don't see .env here in the untracked. So it's not even that it's red. It's just not even, it's out of the picture now. But there is something in the picture, the git ignore file. That's okay. You can have that up in your GitHub and have that being tracked. So I'm going to add that on. And for those of you who are too lazy to type in git add every time, one, you can make an alias. Another thing you can do is just click on the file in the UI and press git add, and it'll run the command for you. So I should have both my files added now to the staging area, and they are ready to be committed. Now let's make our first commit. So to do that, you just run git commit -n, and then in the string, you add some descriptive message, which is showing what sorts of changes were involved in this commit. So here I'm just going to say initial commit and nothing more, just because there's not a lot to it. But I could also, if I wanted to add, say, add git ignore and demo Python file. And when you press enter, it'll basically say 2 files changed, something, something, something. And basically, I successfully created my first commit. Great. And now I can press git status. And I'm no longer seeing those green or reds. Now it's saying on branch master, nothing to commit, working tree clean. So no further changes needed. Everything that's been changed is currently up to date in the committed version. So this is local though. How do we actually get this onto a remote repository where we can share it with other people to access? So that's where GitHub comes in. I'm going to open up github.com. Hopefully you have an account after the last homework. And The first thing you're going to do is in the top right, you can press the plus button and press new repository. So now we're making our first remote repository. If you remember in our terminal, we did git init to make it local, and here's remote. And for the owner, especially for a project, it's going to be important to say NJIT CS490 Spring 21, which is going to allow me and the TAs to access it and grade it. And then I'm going to say lect5 demo NYT. So this is going to be the name of the repository. And I'm going to keep it private for now. I'll probably make it public once I do things later. And then I'm going to skip all this like initializing stuff for now. So just create this repository. Here we go. Awesome. It's set up. And then right now we have a local repository and a remote repository. But how can we actually connect them together? So GitHub here has a couple different ways depending on what you're dealing with. In our case, we are pushing an existing repository, that local one, from the command line. And it says, in order to do that, you run these 3 lines. So let me start with the first one. It's saying git remote add origin, and then this URL. So if you remember from the lecture, we're basically saying this is where our remote repository is. So whenever we're pushing something, then this is where we want it to go. So I'm going to press enter. Next one is git branch -m main. We'll talk about branching more later, but it's basically saying your branch is now going to be called main instead of master. And then finally, this is the key. So git push -u, which stands for upstream, origin main. Origin is basically the repository that we're dealing with. And then main is going to be the branch that we're on. And what we're saying here is we want to push our local repository, all the code that's there, the commits, to the remote repository here on github.com. So I'm going to press enter there. It's going to ask you for your username and your password. So I'm just going to put that in. It's going to do some stuff. And there we go. It was able to successfully push to GitHub. Now let's just make sure that it's actually showing up now on here. So I'm going to refresh this page. And now we see we have our 2 files here. You have the name of the commit showing the last time it was changed. I can open up that file, read through the code, and do all of that. So that's awesome. And now I want to show how we can slowly add more commits on. So I don't want you guys to be creating one commit with all of the code for your project one and just pushing that out at the end. The way that an engineer is going to do it is committing very early and committing very often. So you want to slowly break down your changes into small chunks and then push them as you're finishing them. This can be really useful in the industry just so that people that are reviewing your code can see them in small chunks. And also you can slowly get code out instead of people having to wait for weeks until something is done. So they can see your progress as well. So maybe I want to change something. Let me make a change to this file. Let me add a comment here and say, this is to load your API keys from .env. So I just made it a little bit clearer. I've changed that file now. And let's always run git status to see what's going on. So now you're going to see there's some changes that Git is tracking now. So this file is being tracked, but it knows that there's been some updates that aren't reflected in your official kind of committed version of code. So it's saying modified here. What we can do is git add. So we add this file. Now if we run git status, we can see that this file, the changes that we made, which was just this comment here, is ready to be committed now. So let's make another commit, git commit -m, add more clarity with comments. So I've made my commit. Now that you've set your upstream and everything in the past commands, you can just run git push and put in your same username, password, and there we go. So now we should see this is reflected that new commit 17 seconds ago added more clarity, and your Python file is going to have the comment here in the GitHub version. One last thing I want to show you is just adding a README. So this is super important. Whenever you have something on GitHub, then you want documentation so that people can understand how to use the code, and if there's something that they need some requirements in order to load it up. So I did touch readme.md, which is markdown format, and then I opened it up with C9. And I'm just gonna, you don't need to worry about the syntax for now, but I'm just gonna say lecture 5 demo NYT API. And I'm gonna say, I'm gonna give one quick direction for people. Create.n file in your directory, in your main directory, add NYT key, and then add line, let me just say export NYT key equals your key, and there. So this is just basically going to say this is the line that you need to add in order to make things working. So I'm going to run git status again. We see there is a new file that needs to be added. It's being untracked right now. So I can do git add -a if I want to just add everything that there is. Maybe there's like 20 files that I want. So I've added that. If I do git status, I can see that it's ready to be committed. I can do add readme file in my commit message here. And then finally git push. And let me just add my password. Okay. And now if I refresh and I go to, oops. If I go to the repository main page, this is going to actually show up right here. So now the README is being displayed, and it has some useful instructions, obviously very basic, and you're going to have to do more in your project to get started with my demo. Awesome.